Okay, we're at a good number. I think we can kick off and some more folks will join as we go through. But good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Modern Change Academy session for today. We're going to be covering CSDM for change management. As a reminder, this series happens the fourth Thursday of every month at this time, covering different topics around change management, release, and some others. We won't have a session next week due to the holidays, but we'll be back in January, and we'll try and get our session topics posted on the community site ahead of time so you all know what's coming. With that, I think we can jump in. So before we go, we have the safe harbor. I'm sure you've all seen this before, but this presentation may contain some forward-looking statements. So that's based on our beliefs right now. So please don't take anything as set in stone as it could change. And then just some introduction. So my name is Greg Hollis. I'm an outbound product manager. You may have seen me running similar programs like this. I'm really just here to intro Daniel, who is our main speaker. So Daniel, I'll kick it over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Daniel. I look after change management and actually SLM as well for ServiceNow as the product manager. So I'm responsible for the strategy, innovation and delivery of those products. Been with ServiceNow about, well, just over 10 years and spent a lot of that time in the field leading ITSM teams in EMEA and the architecture team out of UK. Moved to product a couple of years ago and yeah, now doing change management.
And real quick, Daniel, before you go, okay, yeah. So we're gonna start off going over the maturity framework, and then we'll really spend the most of the time on CSDM and change, our focus topic. We have a demo, and we'll have some time for Q&A towards the end, hopefully. We also, please ask your questions throughout the session. If you can just use the Q&A function, post your questions there. We'll try and address them as they come up, or we'll also flag some to address live. So we'll try and pause throughout to address questions live. We'll also have some time at the end. So just please post anything in the Q&A so we can get this queued up there.
And how long is this session, Greg?
An hour.
An hour. So we're looking at probably trying to get to, I think there'll be a fair bit of Q&A at the end of this. So I'm trying to wrap it in time for us to answer all the questions. It's worth pointing out as well, this is fairly new material that I'm presenting. So if you have feedback on the actual material we have as well, feel free to add that to the chat. If you find it super confusing or useful or a mixture, there's things you don't understand, please let us know so we can improve it and we can go back with some better material next time if it doesn't hit the spot, or we can improve where we've done well or whatever. Okay. So the idea is we cover through, first of all, I'm going to talk in general about a maturity framework that we've put together for change management and CMDB CSDM. And the reason we're doing that for change management is we kind of think if we can nail it for change management, we can nail it in a load of places, because change management is probably one of the most complex interactions between CSDM and CMDB that we have in ITSM. So we're going to talk about the maturity framework, then we're going to cover some concepts around services and how we see services as being used in ServiceNow, different types of ways of mapping services and how they can be used in the change process. Then we're going to do a demo, just taking you through some of the kind of more nuts and bolts around where you see these services and where they're configured. And we also may talk a little bit about things that we're going to do in the future. And we need feedback on these things. So we are doing outreach at the moment. Some of you may have been contacted by our research teams or maybe members of the Product Advisory Council. If you're on the Product Advisory Council, you'll have seen some of this material, most of this material already. Okay. So if we kick off with, and ask questions as you go along. If it becomes like, if we get inundated with questions, we will probably field them at the end. But if you raise something in the chat, Greg or Caleb will interrupt me and ask the question at the time. If you feel it's something you want answering in order to facilitate your understanding kind of going forward, just make that clear when you ask a question if you really didn't get something. Okay. So what we're looking at is a maturity framework that we will look to build product around and try and create a best practice or guided practice around CSDM for change management and ITSM. And what we're going to do first is just we gathered up three layers, three kind of main types of customer that we have who are using the CMDB for change. So first of all, there's basic usage of CMDB. So on a change, you have CIs. That might just be a main CI in the CI field. It may be that you're using the affected CIs list to express what CIs are on the change, but you're actually adding references to CIs rather than kind of typing them in the description field. it may surprise some of you to know that most of our customers don't add CIs to the change form, right? So at some point, a lot of our customers never add CIs to the change form because CMDB is complex and hard to maintain. Getting people to add the right CIs can be tricky to do. Getting a change raiser to do it can be confusing. So what we want to do first is establish some frameworks that allow people to add the correct CIs and all the CIs to the change, so we understand what we're changing. When we do that, we can start using things like scheduling and conflict management. We can start understanding who the approvers are from the CIs. And then as a layer above that, we can start looking at linking these CIs to services so that we can start to group things together and make it easier for people to understand the workload. So we can do things like have tech services and tech service offerings that tell us who's delivering that layer of technology, like who's delivering Linux in EMEA, or who's delivering infrastructure in America, or who's delivering a particular app service out to the business. When we do that, we can start leveraging risk assessment better. So we can start moving things out of risk assessment and maybe into things like risk conditions, because we have more structured data to leverage. So we can start seeing things like, does the change affect a critical service? You know, we can use impacted services to tell whether it affects a critical service. We don't need to ask that question in the risk assessment anymore. We've got structured data we can use. We've covered that on previous sessions in Launch and Learns. Previous Launch and Learns as well. I think we may have a slide at the end, but if we don't, all the Launch and Learns we have are available on YouTube. So check out our YouTube channel. I think Phelan can post a link into the chat for all of you to see. When we get to a more advanced layer, what we're looking to do is have an interaction between our services as they're mapped, so an application as it's mapped, and also who provides the technical services that make up that application. Because quite often you have an application that's being delivered, which is made up of several services. It may be the application owner is responsible for delivering something like payroll, but they're relying on people who run databases. They're relying on people who run servers. They're relying on people who run infrastructure, load balancers, and that kind of kit to deliver their service. So it's the interaction between those two types of service, and we'll describe that in a bit more detail later. And really, the end goal, as we'll show in this, is to create a process that allows you to do things like express outages properly. So you have a window for a change, but you could express an outage that covers the particular CIs that you're changing at a particular time. Maybe do things like suppress alerts during the outage window. That's something that people have asked for. And also, you can then tell the business what's happening in terms of change. And so one of the key things that we're looking at here, as I said before, is populating the CIs in the affected CIs list. Also populating the services and impacted services. Maybe also things like business apps, if you're using them, and understanding how they get populated on a change, and then understanding how all that is leveraged in the change process, and how we can traverse that tree. Because the other thing that we've noticed is customers either tell us that not enough appears in those lists if they have an immature CMDB or not many links and things are done manually, or if they have a very good CMDB with a lot of links, they get too much appearing, right? There's too many relationships, and the relationships are all traversed, and you end up with 400 services in the impacted services list when you run impacted services. Then you end up with 5,000 conflicts, and it becomes something that's not so useful. So we want to try and work to make sure that we're getting in the right information and we're presenting people with things that they can actually make decisions on, and they can declutter the conflicts, or they can understand the scheduling, or they can gather the approvers together and have the right approvers on any given change. Okay. Any questions so far popping up? I don't know. If no one interrupts me, I'll carry on. So we have
nothing yet.
Nothing yet. So we have two types of service as we see it, right? We have vertical services and horizontal services. These aren't terms that I've coined, they're industry standard terms. So a vertical service, as we're seeing here, is a way of linking together an application normally with the things that provide that application. Actually, as you'll see later, that vertical service can start at something else. It could start at a database cluster, and it could express the things that make up a database cluster. But we'll talk about an application service for the moment. So you have an application, and you have the things that it depends on, which are mapped out normally through using service mapping. So service mapping, which is a ServiceNow technology, will go out and it will find the relationships between that application service and the kit that it relies on. And that builds a vertical map. And then we can manually create a link between that application service and the business service offering, which is delivering the application out to the business. So the application service tells us the instance of the thing, the system, which is under consideration, which the CIs make up. And then the business tells us how we're delivering it to the business. So the business service, in effect, has no implementation. It relies on the application service to describe its implementation going down. But that gives us our full stack vertically, from the business service offering, which users consume, down to the application service, and then down to all the individual CIs that make up that service. Now, each one of those layers that we see will have owners normally. They may be directly linked to the CIs at a kind of low level of maturity. You may express on every single CI who owns that CI, who manages it, who supports it. There's information on the CIs, and they're leveraged by those. That information is leveraged by all the ITSM processes. So when we assign an incident, the assignment group can be found from looking at the CI on the incident and navigating across from there to the assignment group, the group that supports it. For a change, you could be doing the same thing. You could be looking at who the change manager responsible for that CI is, or who the service owner is. So then we start stepping into the realms of service. Okay? So we understand that a whole group of CIs may be grouped together. We have a business service offering, and someone's responsible for that. Normally someone who provides a liaison between IT and the business to understand the impact and the usefulness and the roadmap for the business services which are being delivered. And then we have things like schedules, right? We have maintenance schedules, blackout schedules, times when you can do changes, times when you can't do changes. And if we look at an application map, we're actually probably going to see quite a few of those schedules and quite a few owners going down that vertical stack. A horizontal map is looking at a particular technology. So instead of going down from the application and then up to the business service, what we do is we segregate the layers of the CMDB according to what's being delivered. So again, industry standard terminology, but looking at this, it's a fairly standard kind of end layer model that we have. It looks slightly different for cloud, but it's similar, maybe even a bit easier in cloud to understand. You tend to have less of a hierarchy. But what we have is we have our business services at the top and our business service offerings. Then we have our application services, which are quite often also expressed through a technical services offering. So we have something like, I don't know, maybe you have Concur doing expense reporting, and you have your application service for Concur production. You have your technical service offering for Concur, and then you have a business service offering like expense reporting. So that tells us our top layer, our kind of logical layer at the top. And then we start stepping down and seeing that Concur is provided on some application servers, which are Linux possibly, and that has a service owner and a service offering, which may be like, I don't know, Linux EMEA production. And we have databases like MariaDB, which will be offered like high security MariaDB EMEA, maybe another offering that we've got at the database layer. And then underneath all of that, we'll have infrastructure, things like SANs, things like hypervisors, things like core network infrastructure, which are kind of big bits of kit that everyone uses. And again, all of these things will have owners. Generally, an application service has an owner. Generally, each of your horizontals will have an owner. And generally, those horizontals are defined by things called dynamic queries, but more on that later. Okay. So that's horizontal and vertical mapping. So vertical mapping is telling us the delivery of an application, the stack that delivers it. And it's a really useful thing for understanding impact, because without a vertical map, we can't understand what depends on what. But actually, it can get quite complex when we have more than one application. When we're hitting more than one application, it can be, if we're changing a bit of core infrastructure at the bottom here, as you can see on this, that it's actually affecting 3 applications or 30 or 300 applications. And then we have a lot of people, a lot of schedules on the map as we go on. So what we need to start understanding is a concept, again, that many of you will be familiar with, which is understanding the blast radius of a change. Because just because something has a relationship in the CMDB doesn't mean it necessarily is impacted by a change. So we take out some infrastructure here. We've got a bit of infrastructure we're taking out Tuesday night. And that means that there are some servers that are connected to it, but they fail over, right, to the EMEA infrastructure. They're not impacted by this change. And that means the application that sits on those servers, the database that sits on those servers, the application service which consumes them, and then the business service is unaffected by the change in infrastructure in America. But there are some servers that don't fail over, so we see the database is going to be taken down, and that means the application is going to be down, and we need to tell the business. And you can see this would multiply across your vertical maps. You'd have various vertical maps that are impacted to a certain extent, and some that aren't affected by a change, even though they're mapped into each other. And this kind of proliferation is what leads to having lots and lots of things within the impacted services on the change in ServiceNow. Okay, so what we can do as well is, if we understand who's impacted by the change, we can start taking people out of the change. By all means, we can still notify them the change is going on, but we don't need them to make active decisions all the time now. So we can reduce the number of people and the number of schedules that we need to consider when we're making change. So if I take these people out, you can see that now we're only considering people up to the level of impact. We're saying, is your service impacted? If it isn't impacted by it, we don't need to go any further along that vertical map. And we can start doing that across the application services. Okay, so what we do now is we understand the horizontals with relation to the vertical service delivery. So actually now, instead of having to ask lots and lots of questions about something, we can say, okay, we're changing the infrastructure. What services are impacted at the next layer? And those services can individually, each one of them can cover several CIs or several hundred CIs, and they can make decisions about whether the service impact goes outwards from where they are. So you can see here we've got, again, kind of representative map of a layered delivery of an application service. We've got the infrastructure service saying, yeah, we're out. We've got the Linux service then saying, yes, some of our services are out because of this, or some of our offerings. We've got the database service saying, well, that means some of us are out. And that then translates into the application services knowing whether they're out or not at that particular time. And that allows us to reduce the number of people, again, that are involved. So instead of having people for each CI that's impacted, we're just looking at the services. And again, like I said, those services can cover many CIs. And that means when we get to the application level, then we can talk out to the business and say which business services or offerings are affected by the change. And that allows us a full stack communication from low level infrastructure out to the business. So talking about blast radius quickly now. So this is translating the map that we had before into concentric circles. And we've still got our three applications vertically mapped on this. We don't have lines between them now, but you can see them spreading out from the middle. So what we're doing is we're effectively asking the people in the middle and then walking out from there to see who's impacted by a change. And that allows us to understand correctly who's impacted by the change. And the key thing about doing this is we can raise outage records from within change management. So as we walk out, we can say this service is impacted. I'm going to raise an outage record for my service. And then that tells us that the service is out. And the next layer of service along can say, well, the service I rely on is out and I'm downstream from them. So I may be out too. I'll make a decision and we walk out along the concentric circles using outage records. And then we can use those outage records for things like event suppression. Again, all this is a configuration within ServiceNow. So we're talking about things that we would currently need to configure within ServiceNow. We currently need to manually raise those outages. We currently need to manually look to see if we're a service downstream from the next service. But what we want to understand is, and this is something for the Q&A later, whether this approach makes things easier for you, whether it's something you could adopt. If we gave you assistance at understanding where your outages are, if we gave you assistance at understanding what the next level of outage is, and if we gave you assistance with things like event suppression for outages. And that would help us build a list within the change. So we've got our affected CIs, which is the CI directly being changed. And then we've got our impacted services, which tells us everything that could potentially be impacted, everything if we walk out along those application maps all the way, all the services that could be impacted by the change. That's how it currently works. And then out from there, we've got what is actually impacted is expressed with an outage record. Okay, any questions so far? Have we got anything coming up?
No, still nothing.
Okay. Right, I'm going to demo some stuff now. I'm going to have a quick look at an instance, and I'm going to have a look to see just where some of these things live within change, and just answer some questions maybe for you about where you configure these settings and where some of the confusion that I see lies in the configuration at the moment. Just as a quick disclaimer before we go through this, we're actually looking, so last few months we've been looking at this topic, and our doc writer is writing, improving the documentation that we have for this area, because we really want to get people to nail conflict checking and impacted services. It's a complex area of change, and we want it to work within the CMDB. So we want to take a kind of prescribed approach and say, this is how we think you should be using it. This is where the settings are to configure it. These are your options. And then looking into the future, these are the things that we're going to be delivering out to you to make things easier, to make things more automated, to make things a bit easier for everyone to understand, from the change raiser, the service owners, the approvers, the assessors, the people who schedule the change managers, all those people. Okay. Switch across to demo now. Okay. So first of all, I'm going to go to the properties landing page in ServiceNow. So as I said before, there is a document for this. This is the document that we're looking to improve. We're looking to provide an explainer for this. This does tell you what the things do literally, but it doesn't explain very well what you're actually changing and what you're configuring and what the impact of that configuration will be. So if we look in here, we have a whole set of things to do with change management. I'm not even going to touch on conflict checking at the moment. Maybe we can do another call on that later. But actually, within here, there are some settings which will kind of radically change how change management does the impact calculation, the impact assessment for change. So if we look at, first of all, the impacted services related list is generated via events. So at the moment, what we do is, if you switch this on, the impacted services will run in the background. Okay, so it won't hold the change. It won't stop you from being able to move on with the change. It will just run. And when it's finished, it will populate the change. And one of the things we're looking to do quite soon is make that into something that has something called a callback, so that you can tell when refresh impacted services has completed running. Actually, it's a little more complex than that, because you can have several people go to a change and all click refresh impacted services, and you can have it running like 5 times at once. We don't need to go into that detail right now, but actually what's happening there is it runs in the background and populates the impacted services for you. How it does that can also be set. So if we look at this next one, impacted CI services related list is generated from all CIs in the affected CIs list. Okay, so what this does is it means that it will look at a table, I'll show you in a minute, called the service associations table. So it will look for the CIs in the affected CI list, and it will look in the service association table, and it will pull back any service that has a direct link to that CI. Okay, so I'll talk about that now. So if we look at the service association table, that's normally built through dynamic CI groups or ServiceNow. I'm looking at dynamic CI groups right now. And you can see in here, we have a group of service CIs, which are given the name All Windows Services. And actually that will express to us, I think I've got it predefined in here. Let me see if I can find it. I'll go into here. Just give it a second to load. So in here, what we're doing is we've expressed a query that will group things together and say all these things are this particular service. So what we can do is we can create a dynamic query that will go out and find, for instance, all the CIs that are in the class of Windows Server that have the operational status of operational, that are production servers, that's the environment they work in, and that maybe their location is EMEA. So we can start building queries from the data on our CIs to group together CIs very quickly and provide those horizontal services. So what we can do is, if we leverage that, we can see that when a Windows server, for instance, a Linux server in America, when that is in the affected CI list for a change, it will look into the service association table and it will pull back in all the application services which are mapped to that in the service association table. So as I said before, the service association table contains 2 fields. One is the child, the CI in question, and the other is the service it belongs to. So it's effectively a lot quicker than trying to traverse all the relationships in your CMDB. It's a way of grouping things together and just having a simple parent-child relationship. Here's my CI, this is the service. Here's my CI, this is the service. That allows us to populate the impacted services very quickly. Okay. When you build these things, I'm just going to go into one of the queries. You build a group query. If we go into this one, and you can see in here, there's an encoded query written here. So your admins for ServiceNow will be able to build these queries that specify what the values are that mean that that thing is a member of a dynamic CI group. And that means that it will be populate the service association table. And you can very quickly see whether an affected CI is linked, which service is an affected CI and a change is linked to. If you don't have that property set, what will happen is the CMDB will go out, or the ServiceNow will go out, and it will walk the relationships in the CMDB outward from that CI. So if you have a bit of core infrastructure, it may well find like 50% of your CMDB. It will start walking outwards in relationships, and it will pull in every CI, and it will carry on walking until it hits the max depth property, which ITOM people set. It's a property within ITOM. So it can go out like 10 layers and pull back all the CIs. That's when customers report to us, they're seeing like 3,000 CIs on every change that they make. So populate the service offering related list from the impacted services and CIs related list. What this will do is it will find any service offering related to a service in the impacted services list. And that is a parent service. So if you have something like, if you have a technical service called Linux Server and you put it into the services list, it will then find all the service offerings for that service. It looks on the service record and finds a parent. We're looking to make some improvements around this in the product. I think they're more representative of CSDM in ServiceNow. I don't feel it's fully representative right now doing this particular type of check, but more on that later. The same thing we can do for business applications. So if we have an app service in our impacted services, it can populate the business application list by looking at parent-child. Again, this is probably quite in line with CSDM, because you will normally have a business application expressed for each one of your application services. So a business application is something like, I don't know, SAP Concur, and an application service would be SAP Concur Prod, Test, Dev. Those will be the application services. So what we can do is we can then, because we know that, we can then look at the business applications list, and we can see if you have data that's on the business application, like the lead architect for that business application or the owner of that business application, they can be notified of a change or involved in the change process by referencing that field. Okay. I think that's all the properties I wanted to see in here. So it's very important to understand, just to recap, that there are different ways for impacted services to run. So for impacted services, you can traverse the CMDB using relationships, or you can look at the more efficient service association table, which contains links mappings from service mapping between a CI and an application service, or links between a particular CI and a particular service offering in ServiceNow, again, via something that looks like or is expressed as something like an application service as well. So you could have all your SQL Server, all your nodes in SQL Server clusters, you could have that expressed, or you could have a particular cluster expressed in there. But what it does is it builds a relationship between a single CI and an application service. So if you have the CI in the affected CIs list, the service will be brought into the impacted services list. And then if you have that in the impacted services list and you have the other thing checked, saying bring in the service offering, if there's a service offering related to it, it will bring in the service offering into the things list. And it will bring the business app into the business app list as well. Okay. I'm going to pause there for a second and go back to the slide deck, but I just want to know if there's any questions that have popped up so far. I think I can see a couple of comments.
Still, nothing related to the content though at this point.
Okay. Right, go back to the slide deck. So what we talked about there is defining service context. What we're doing is we're relating CIs directly to a service offering or to an application service. So we're saying all these CIs are related to this application service. They are the things controlled by the person who owns this application. And we're saying that these CIs are related to, particular CIs may be related to a technical service offering, and that's our horizontal service. So we can understand who owns technology from the point of view of who's running that technology, who's supporting that technology, what's the service offering delivering that technology, like databases, like application servers, like core infrastructure. And we can also understand the vertical service map, which tells us how that application is being delivered, and we can understand the CIs in there. And by understanding the interaction between those two things, we can start to understand a bit more about the layers that need to communicate to make the change process efficient and effective, and not bring too many CIs in, but bring the right things in for the approval decisions, for scheduling, for conflict checking and impact. Ian, do you want to come off mic? Can Ian just come off mic, Greg, or do you have to make him come off mic?
Let me look.
Or you can type if you feel you don't want to talk.
Oh, it was an accidental hand raise.
Okay, cool.
We do have a couple of questions coming through in the chat.
Should we do that?
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so from Samuel, hi, shall the business service offerings be related directly to the CIs or be inherited through the application service?
So CSDM tells us that they should be through the application service. So business service, well, it does depend a little bit. We're not talking about end user CIs here. So you may well have relationships. I don't know why you would ever do it. It seems like a lot of maintenance, but you may well have a relationship between a business service offering and some laptops if it's an end user support one. I don't think I'd do it like that, but I could see why you would. For the delivery of kind of applications out to the business, you should have an application service which describes the environments you're delivering: production, test, dev, etc., production EMEA, production US. That describes the system. That's the application service. And then from there, you should hop either directly into a business service offering, probably directly into a business service offering. So this business service offering, which is EMEA payroll, is linked to the application EMEA payroll prod. Yeah, does that answer the question?
Yep, seems like it. And then
Yeah,
one from
business services
James.
don't have implementation. They're just a way of expressing what IT is doing. The services that IT offers, they're a way of expressing that in a way the business understands. So, for instance, like payroll or like expense reporting instead of calling it Concur, or like end user computing instead of putting like Office 365 and Excel and Outlook and all these things into your service map.
Yeah, and then we have Vincent. I'm going to take you off mute if you want to ask your question.
Sorry, I hit the wrong button.
Oh, you're good.
Okay. Just going to show a couple of slides just to express how we think this looks. So we have a CMDB here. We have a CMDB with people who own CIs and a lot of schedules, right? There's a lot to maintain in this picture, and people will have much bigger CMDBs than this. It's just representative. What we can do with our dynamic queries is we can understand, we can group those things together and have one person and one schedule for each of the offerings. It may be that AMS infrastructure has like, several offerings. It may have AMS infrastructure, high resilience and low resilience. That kind of stuff is nuanced and it's more to do with the CSDM talk than the change talk. But basically you're grouping things together so that you have one place where they're maintained. Actually, within the dynamic queries, when you within CSDM, when you group things together, it then can automate the propagation of data between those items. So if you set the support group on the service offering, it can automate that being synced with the CIs that are related to that dynamic query. So we've got less to manage and it's more effective. And what we're doing is really creating a service boundary. So what we're saying is that within this service boundary, that service owner controls what's going on. So they get to say when things happen, they get to control their schedule. But if things if things have an impact beyond their service boundary, that's when they need to ask other people, right? That's when they need to get approval from other services that consume them, that it's okay to take things down on Tuesday night. That's what change management is about, understanding the interaction between these things, understanding when something happens within a service boundary and getting a service owner or an application owner to okay it. And also understanding when the impact is beyond the service boundary to get the people who are beyond the service boundary to say whether they're okay with the impact or whether they're also impacted. So it's one of the core kind of capabilities of change management is to understand service boundaries and understand how impact flows between services. And by doing it service by service, you're actually conceptually, although you're handling the same amount of data, conceptually you're making it easier for people to understand. Just going to run through some examples we've got in here. So if you look at this, again, a simplified map, we have something that's happening with the AMS infrastructure. And they are taking the service down on Tuesday night. And they would raise an outage saying that they've got some planned maintenance on Tuesday night. And the AMS infrastructure or the AMS Linux service owner would then say, well, that means I'm out as well. All my servers are going to be out if the infrastructure is out. So I'm going to raise an outage on my service as well. And the person who's MariaDB would also say, well, if they're out, half my servers are out. So maybe my US offering's out and my EMEA offering is not out. And that may take out payroll. And if the payroll app service is out, it means HR services have an outage as well on Tuesday night, a planned outage on Tuesday night. And that allows us to understand exactly who's impacted at the right level of granularity and who's responsible for monitoring that impact, for recovering from that impact, for understanding the incidents related to that impact, for maybe suppressing events to do with that impact. It tells us who's responsible for all those things within the change process. Just have a look at another example. So this time, if we look, the MariaDB high security offering is not out. So we've had AMS infrastructure goes out, Linux AMS is out, but actually MariaDB high security this time are going to fail over to EMEA. There's no impact to their service. So they don't raise an outage. And then we don't need to ask payroll production if there's an outage because they're reliant on the databases and the databases aren't going down. So HR don't have an impact. They can still see the change. They're still on the impacted services. They can still see that they're a potentially impacted service from a change that's going ahead. You might want to ask them to cap. I don't know, there's various parts of the process where you might want to inform them that something is happening. But the fact still remains that you know from this that the MariaDB high security person has confirmed that they are resilient to that change and it shouldn't go any further down the map. So you don't need to invite, 100 people to authorize the change because the MariaDB high security service owner said, no, we're good. Past my point, past my service boundary, we're fine. The thing that allows us to do as well more effectively is understand post-change analysis. Because if we've confirmed our outages as the change process is going ahead, we can then start to understand whether something actually was taken out or not. So as you know, after the change, if a change is considered a failed change, there's impact that wasn't expected on the change. So we can find that actually, despite the fact that we said that MariaDB High Security was resilient and wasn't going to fail, we did see impact the payroll service, which affected HR services and took some end users out from being able to do payroll at that time. So that gives us a delta between what we expected to happen and what actually happened. And that's useful for change managers too. So I just wanted to go back over that and say that at the moment, a lot of this is possible quite manually within ServiceNow. Raising outages is quite a manual process. You have to kind of click on the outage button and raise it from the change. And then you have to look at the change and see whether you're out or not. And it's quite manual at the moment. What we want to do is probably, if our customers want us to do it, we want to get better at that. I want to know whether that's something that resonates with you, whether we should get better at outage recording or whether we should just leave it. The other thing is, are service boundaries important to how you work with your change process? If we made it easier to understand the service boundaries, if we made it easier to configure and express those service boundaries, would that make it easier for you as well? Because that's something as well that, if that's something that's important to you, and we're going to have enough time on the clock, I'm going to stop talking in a couple of moments. We want to hear back from you and see whether you want it to happen. We've got technologies like machine learning and Now Assist, generative AI and Now Assist, that have a lot of opportunities. We're looking at them, our R&D teams are looking at them right now to try and make it easier to understand what your service boundaries are, to make it easier to infer these things, not have to draw them kind of in paint on your CMDB. But nowadays, a lot of the things like what a service relies on at a given time can be fairly dynamic. You can have things that just are switching over all the time. It's very difficult these days to understand sometimes what the impact of a change may be in 2 weeks' time. So what we want to be able to do is have a good idea of the confidence of our impact of change. When we plan a change, it's not just about what we think will be impacted, it's how confident are we that that will be the impact? How good are that service at knowing whether they impact people downstream from them or not, whether they're taken out at that time? So really looking at modern change management, and this is part of the modern change management series, what we're looking to do is start more dynamically understanding the interaction between services, start creating records like outages. Outage is a good record to express it, but do that kind of more automatically, saying, we think there's an outage on your service at this time. Can you confirm that? Or can you say it's not actively say it's not you don't think it'll affect you? And that allows people to communicate better at a high level, at the service level, and not have to have the interaction between CIs, which takes a lot of time and a lot of work and can involve a lot of people being involved in a change. So you can really focus in and see what's contentious. What does actually interfere with blackout windows that you've got for a business service, and what actually doesn't affect the business service. So you don't need to have them involved, have them informed, but not necessarily involved in the change. And then lastly, looking at post-change analysis, was there a service that had some CIs that was having a change in, and the same service had another bunch of CIs that all suffered some event storm during the change window? It gives us a strong inference that that change may have actually failed, even though we don't have any direct link. Do we want to link those incidents to change? Do you want to be offered the opportunity to link those things to change, and talk through what we think the impact of a change was, and whether we think changes were actually unsuccessful or successful? So again, lots of opportunities around Now Assist, Gen AI and ML that we're excited about, but we want to know from you and hear back now, and as we go along, whether you think this is exciting, whether you think it's interesting, whether you think it helps with modern change management and helps with the volume and velocity, stability and compliance of change. In a world where we see more changes than ever, more CIs than ever, more impacts than ever, and more effect from the impacts, more effect to the business. Okay, I'm going to stop talking there. And if there are questions or people want to come off mute, actually, I'll let Greg, you can control what happens now. Vincent, you had your hand up before, so I'll let you can go first. Or if it's just another accident, that's fine too.
Yeah, Vincent, go ahead if you want. You're still on mute. Just FYI.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So when you're talking about the map and what's impacted by a change to a specific configuration item, what happens? How does the system interact when you have multiple changes for the same application? Right. So if you're doing, for instance, we have some applications where we have unique changes for our web team and our database team and our application teams, right? So they'll open up 3 different changes, right? So how do we correlate those 3 different changes with each other from a service map perspective, as opposed to maybe doing one change with a couple different tasks, change tasks was in there that are specific to those configuration items or those teams that are doing those implementations
So
for that
first,
same. Go ahead.
so first thing I would say is you're on the right track with using changes to the change tasks for this. I think it's important. If it kind of walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, right? It's a duck. If it's a change to a set of CIs, then you should have a change for that thing and express the CIs on it. They shouldn't be split into change tasks. It just obscures things then. One of the things we're looking to do, and my colleague Colin O'Brien, who's in the same kind of business unit in ServiceNow, we're talking about having kind of multi-layered change. So, having the ability to have like a master change ticket that covers several changes and then have maybe releases on top of that. Again, it's early days on that at the moment, but I think that's one way of looking to correlate them. The other thing is, if you have that vertical map, the changes would be those changes that you talked about would be going on within each of the services on that map. So you would have the service owner for your databases would be responsible for expressing whether their change would impact the application. And the people who are doing changes to the application to the application servers again would be responsible for telling you whether that change impacted the application. So ultimately, you'd have a change. The service offering field on the change would be the technology that's been delivered, databases and applications, etc. And the application service would be in the impacted services list for all those changes. And then when you run conflict checking, you'd be looking to see whether there were multiple changes happening at the same time, which all impacted the same application service. And that's something that happens in platform right now.
Gotcha. So from when you talk about that, like a master change and having, I guess child changes underneath that, right? That are all part of that same release, so to speak. Right now, the system doesn't currently conflict check against tasks or against assignment groups within those tasks, right?
Yeah.
So, and then also approvals are not driven, they're driven off across the workflow, right? From assess to CAB and implement and all that, as opposed to being able to get approvals on tasks. Is we basically drive our process upon those groups, those implementation groups, to approve them prior to CAB, because they need a review, right, to understand that what work they have to do is the actual change complete. If my implementation instructions are clear enough for my team to execute, stuff of that nature. Problem is we can't get approvals on those because the approvals are done at the change level and not at the task level, and we can't intermingle those two tables, right? So the thought process forward for you guys?
I think that the first thing is moving towards having changes for each of the things. I don't know the details of what you're doing here, so I'm not going to comment too much, but it sounds like they're individual changes, and we'd like to try and group those things together better. And we're looking at ways of doing that so that you can have like dependent changes, etc. And the other thing is, in terms of scheduling, it might not be that a given change that all the CIs are being changed at the same time, and it could be things that are being done differently. Like a patching change could have 200 servers in. Some people open a patching change for a week and stick 200 servers in it, and then the change window just opens, and then that just blocks other changes from being conflict checked. So if you can split that change up into several groups of when you're actually making the changes, that allows you to have a change for each one of those groups and actually be able to automate how that works, right? How you split up complex changes and understand it is something we're looking at kind of medium term, like 2026 kind of target around using maybe notice to help with scheduling. So there's a few ways we're looking to help. I think it's not something. I think the complexity of kind of multi-change is something that doesn't happen right now. The other thing that I'd point you towards is we're reworking CAB. We're looking to deliver CAB in Service Ops Workspace in May. From that point onwards, and there'll be more kind of outreach to customers, etc., on that product. We're doing user research on it right now. We're building the engineering for it. But being able to understand more and more changes through CAB, so understand where changes are contentious, but also see a picture of what's changing in that area for that CAB at a given time, and then focusing in the CAB meeting on particular changes, not just high impact, high risk, but maybe some changes that are just tricky to schedule, low risk, medium risk changes that are tricky to schedule. So we're looking to use CAB more and more to do this too. But we have a way of doing it. It's beyond the scope of this call, but we're thinking about that too. So different approaches. So we've got Now Assist, we've got CAB, we've also got using release management, digital product release, and also just having kind of the multi-change environment, which is something we're looking at too. We've got lots of other questions. Greg, do you want to guide me towards
Yeah.
which question. Hope that helped, Vince.
Let's do Stephen. He had a question in the Q&A and has also raised his hand, so I'll have him go off mute.
Hey, thanks. Yeah. Yeah, it was kind of clarifying to my Q&A, but it was about, applying all of this to and getting value out of it as you are working through applying the CSDM in stages. So, I see on the slide you have here, I see it's a work in progress. But like on the application focused, where in the crawl you're trying to focus on the business service and the application service, or excuse me, the business application and the application service, and then finding the discoverable CIs. Are those kind of lumped into the basic level, or because there's kind of, from what I see, it seems like there's a jump from the basic to intermediate. And I know we're talking about the services field and leveraging that. But I was just curious, is there going to be some guidance on how to really apply that as you mature the CSDM to get value along the way?
So the CSDM, first of all, I understand the crawl, walk, run, fly methodology, but actually when I've worked with customers, and I've worked with maybe hundreds of customers around CSDM, that actually within an organization, you will have crawl, walk, run, fly going on all at once, right? You will have some areas that are really quite advanced with it. You'll have other areas that are super basic with what they've got in the CMDB. So the idea around this methodology is it kind of touches on across those different areas. So it's like, if you're at this stage with basic CIs on a change, then this is what you can do. If you're intermediate and you have your technical services expressed, you get some more outcomes. And if you're advanced, you have your business services mapped in and maybe business apps, etc. You have a full CSDM picture, then these are the outcomes you'd expect. So within your business, you may be at different stages at different times, different places. In terms of the practicalities of it, yes, we are looking, and we're looking to invest in making it so that it's easier to configure ITSM processes and the CMDB to get results from CSDM. Because I think CSDM is now at a fairly mature stage. It's fairly well understood. Getting there can be a long journey. But from an ITSM point of view, we want to be able to get you the bits of CSDM that really matter for ITSM. Because a lot of those items are fairly organizational for ITSM. There's a lot of work that goes into ITOM and understanding it's really important to understand the attributes of a particular server and how much RAM it's got or what your cloud estate looks like. But actually for service management, a lot of the CSDM attributes are things like who owns a service, who's the owner, what's the managed by group, what's the relationship between a service and a CI. And that's why I've focused on just a few elements of CSDM for ITSM, because they're the ones that I see as important. And from talking to customers, that seems to resonate.
Right. Thank you.
Great. Thea, I see your hand, but real quick, we had one more in the chat relating to just content and guidance, Daniel. So this is from an anonymous. We're looking to configure our first change model. Is there a guide that walks you through how to build out what our change manager is asking for?
I don't know what your change manager has asked for, but there are guides to building this stuff out. So you're anonymous, so I don't know who you are, but if you want to reach out to Greg or Kaylin and tell us who you are, I'd be really interested to see whether we have the right guidance out there. There'll be a slide at the end that points you towards community. We have a recording on change models. We have a modern change management webinar. We have material that we can send you or you can download, which helps talk through it. If we don't have, we have stuff in docs. We are looking to at some point put into product a guided setup around change models, but there's just a load of tasks that we need to do which are more important than that right now. But if you should be now with the material we have at a point where you can configure the change models, where enough information is out there on how to do it. Just as another thing as well, we're looking to add some more content around change models, some kind of more built out change models, and we're always building additional functionality around what change models do. So please reach out to us if you need any additional materials or you feel like the materials that you've been shown don't help, because we need to do better then.
Yeah, I'll post my email in the chat just so folks have it if they want to reach out. Okay, Thea, if you want to come off mute.
Yep, I think you may have answered my question. This was going back to the initial question with the change records and having multiple things happening for the one change record. But I was trying to understand, well, how do you define the window? So if there's prerequisite changes that have to occur before the web service is updated. Is that where you would use the C task, or still create a separate change for that window? So like not having a block of, a whole week for something to be implemented just because something's going, a little bit earlier or a day or two earlier.
I think dependencies within change is something, there's a few places you can do it depending on what the specific context is. Change tasks are appropriate in a lot of cases, right? If one team's got to reboot the server, take the server offline before another team apply a patch, before another team then switch it on again, right? They feel like change tasks where you're kind of very granular in the weeds with the thing, and you're just describing almost an implementation plan by doing tasks. Where you've got other things like, I don't know, maybe the data center needs to be provisioned before you can put the servers into it. That feels more like a project, right? And I'd be looking at using strategic portfolio management to understand the project planning, the program planning around those things, and having changes come off that. In the middle of the two, you've got digital product release, which is you have a release chain, and this is most commonly seen with like continual integration type systems where you have a whole set of changes which will be being dropped in. You may be doing 10 or 100 changes a day to a system, and those will be feature flagged as being off, and then on a certain date you switch them all on. Your new banking app, or I don't know, an online store closed retail shopping app. You may be dropping code in constantly, and then at a certain point, feature release 530 goes live and you switch the flags on and users get those things. That's release. So at one level, like on the really super heavy level, you've got programs and projects which are handled in strategic portfolio. The other level is you've got release management, which handles the overarching kind of program of, say, patching. If you're doing patching and you've got 50 changes that make up a patching program that goes on for 2 months. It may be that you have a release to a product, and over some time you're making code drops over a week to update the product gradually with changes, and then you're feature flagging, switching them on at the end of the week and making a release. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got the C tasks, as you talked about, which is kind of very granular implementation tasks for a given change. I can't comment specifically on what works best, because if I talk to 10 customers, there'd be 10 different ways of doing things.
It'll be different ways. Okay. That's kind of what I thought.
But from the point of view of conflict checking, we're looking to kind of use more analysis, more machine learning, more AI around conflict checking, because it's so complex. The thing is, at the moment, either you find no conflicts or 5,000. And that's not because we're doing a bad job with conflict checking. We're bringing all the conflicts in. But the problem is, unless you start breaking changes down, unless you start really understanding the impact of changes, unless you have really good maintenance schedules, which are expressed at kind of the service offering level, it makes it so much simpler to understand, if you do that, what a conflict might look like.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so we had one, Martin posted this. He's having some issues with his headset, so he can't come off mute. But so regarding outages, we sometimes struggle in situations where some core infrastructure failed and many business services are affected. Creating 20 to 30 outages for the various business services seems wrong, hard to understand for users. Instead, I would like to create one outage, which is linked to multiple business services. This seems not to be possible today.
Yeah, we need to work on the outage record and the outage process. We don't have an outage process right now. So you're describing outage for incident, I think, not outage for change, because if you have that happens, you have outages for an incident, and then you link the incidents to change, because you're describing an unplanned outage. I think it's a very valid use case, and you're right to raise it here. I'm just kind of pointing out a nuance. What I was talking before mainly about was planned outages, where you say this service will be out because we've got a change. Now, what we do to facilitate what you've talked about, which is having one outage with lots of business services on it, and I don't mind which way you do it, is actually we need some automation around understanding who would need to confirm an outage, because even if you do have 20 business services on outage, or you have 20 outages, one for each business service, you still need the service owner to say, yes, this is an outage. This was an outage on my service. You can't just generate them, because then you end up with loads of records and everyone disagreeing about what an outage is. So I'd say whether it's a planned outage or unplanned outage, what we need to do is have more of a thing around someone being told proactively that we think there's been an outage, we think there's currently an outage, or we think there might be an outage, a planned outage on your service at this time. Can you have a look and confirm it? Because I think that's one of the core responsibilities of a service owner, which we don't really take into account a lot of time, in practice and in ServiceNow's product, is that those outages need to be owned by someone and confirmed by someone. And if you have that, then you can start understanding the difference between, what you perceived as would happen, so your planned outages, and what did happen in terms of your unplanned outages, for services. I hope that answered.
Great. Okay, we have two. Let's try and get through at least two more. Okay, so we have one from the chat. What is the ServiceNow best practice to manage the change related to non-production applications or infrastructure?
You should express the service offering, and the service offering should be a non-production service offering. I would say it would be like a really high-level answer to that. You can use approval policies, and you can use risk conditions, and you can use risk assessments, and you can use AI and ML-based risk assessment to tell that this is a lower risk change, this has a lower impact. The impact, looking at those vertical services, the vertical service will look up to an application service, which is non-production. So you'll know it's non-production. Now, in a lot of environments, non-production app can still be pretty critical, right? Your pre-prod application for a healthcare provider or for a bank will still be like a regulated application environment with real data in it normally. It's still important. But the point is that when you look up these application chains, the vertical map, you will see at the top, you will see a non-production application. But equally, the delivery of the services like MariaDB we talked about earlier, or high security Linux, or whatever it is that we're doing, the offering should be maybe a production offering and a non-production offering, or production EMEA offering and a non-production EMEA offering, or whatever way you want to express your offerings. I would say the difference in a service, the offering for production and the offering for sub-production, in my mind, should always be separate. Because you have different SLAs against them also. There's so many reasons why they need to be separate. And then you build your dynamic query looks up on the server, whether it's production or non-production, you separate them out that way automatically. Last question?
Yes, let's go to Dustin.
Dustin?
You may be muted still, Dustin.
We didn't do the poll. We had a good discussion, though, right?
Yeah, we got questions were more important.
Yeah, that's my miss. That wasn't Greg or Caleb. Dustin, if you don't come off mute, we're going to skip your question. I think I don't mind that. If you have another question, just drop it in the chat. We'll try and answer it. We did go back and answer the questions that we didn't get through. Call to action. So this is another, again, are we going to post this slide deck somewhere, or are we just going to have the recording? I don't know what we do with this. Caleb?
We haven't been posting the decks.
Okay.
Let me TBD, because I do want to share the call to action. So let's see if we can post it. We will absolutely be sharing the recording. So I sent the link in the chat of where we'll post the recording. And maybe what I'll do is update that article with some of these call to action links. So you also have all these as well. So I posted it about 2 minutes ago. So please save that. That's where we're going to post all the we post all the recordings from the past sessions here, and there's also a registration link, and we have the info about the upcoming sessions as well. So we'll make sure all these good links get out to everyone.
I look at the YouTube stuff, the comments on YouTube. We look at the feedback. Be honest about the feedback. This is a complex subject to explain, and I won't have done it like perfectly, by any means. Please give us feedback on what you understood and what you didn't understand, what you think achievable, what you think is not achievable, where we're on the right track, where we're not on the right track, because we need to understand it. So please, honest feedback about what you feel about this, how you felt, how you received the session, and whether you think we're on track or not. Cool. Thanks very much, everyone.
Great. Thanks, everyone.